Good evening, I'm Cynthia Ng, and these are our top stories for tonight. India and Russia are among countries invited to join the Board of Peace on Gaza. And Danish Prime Minister says Europe will not be blackmailed by Donald Trump. All that and more coming up on AWANI International. US President Donald Trump has invited dozens of countries, including Russia and India, to join the new Board of Peace aimed at overseeing the reconstruction of Gaza. At least 8 more countries have also confirmed receiving invitations, with Hungary, Vietnam, and Canada accepting. India's invitation was confirmed by the US ambassador to New Delhi in a post on X, but India has not yet announced if it will participate. While Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says its president Vladimir Putin is currently studying the proposal. The US says a $1 billion contribution secures permanent membership on the board, with funds to go towards Gaza's reconstruction. Other countries invited to join include Germany, Pakistan, Jordan, Greece, Australia, Canada, Turkey, and Egypt, with official members expected to be announced soon. The body will oversee the ceasefire's second phase, including to disarm Hamas, establish an international security force, and start reconstruction in Gaza. However, a charter of the board, seen by several media outlets, makes no mention of Gaza at all. Instead, it describes the board as a US-led body aimed at handling conflicts around the world, a role the United Nations has been doing for decades. The plan to put Gaza under the supervision of a foreign-led Board of Peace has raised concerns it could resemble a form of external control. Experts say the structure gives Palestinians little real power in decision-making.
The board itself, the structure that's been put in place, this 2-tiered board of exclusively foreigners with no Palestinians involved. In fact, the first tier is almost entirely made up of Americans, plus Tony Blair, and includes the World Bank president. And then there's this second tier that includes regional stakeholders and others, but also no Palestinians. It's really only the technical committee in which that is made up of Palestinian technocrats that obviously has a Palestinian identity and role, but we don't know what the relationship will be. Between the broader foreign entity of the Board of Peace and the Palestinian Technical Committee.
Will the Palestinian Technical Committee have real influence, or will Israel's power on the ground ultimately shape decisions?
So their priority is to destroy Hamas, and not to govern Gaza or to stabilize Gaza. And in fact, those two missions are in conflict. So where will the Board of Peace land? Will they adopt Israel's definition of stability, which is to restrict aid or to condition aid on compliance with its own terms, to use aid as a weapon, to promote forces that are basically at odds with the Palestinian interest.
Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen says Europe will not be blackmailed by Washington's tariff threats linked to Greenland. This comes after US President Donald Trump threatens to impose new tariffs on 8 European allies if they oppose his proposed takeover of the autonomous Danish territory.
Trump said the tariffs would target Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the UK, starting with a 10% levy on all goods from February 1st, potentially rising to 25% by June. Frederiksen and other European leaders had warned the move would undermine transatlantic relations and risk a dangerous escalation. They are expected to discuss options at an emergency summit in Brussels on January 22nd. On Monday, Trump said Washington would take decisive action to eliminate what he called a Russian threat in Greenland. He has insisted the territory is critical to U.S. security and has not ruled out the use of force, which has drawn sharp international criticism.
European weakness necessitates United States control of Greenland for global stability, says Treasury Secretary of the United States, Scott Bessent. He adds that European leaders would eventually accept American ownership of the territory, adding that the move serves the interests of Greenland, Europe, and the United States.
He framed Greenland as a critical asset in an increasingly competitive global landscape, pointing to strategic rivalry with Russia and China. In his words, the issue is part of a wider geopolitical contest rather than a narrow territorial dispute. Bassen also sought to downplay concerns about escalation. He said he has not recently discussed emergency powers with the president and rejected suggestions that military force could be required. His comments follow President Donald Trump's warning that the United States could impose tariffs on European Union countries that oppose an American takeover of Greenland. That list includes Denmark, a long-standing US ally, and the country that currently governs the territory.
More news coming up shortly after the break. Welcome back. Ukraine is set to resume talks with the US this week on ending its nearly 4-year war with Russia. The next round of discussions will take place at the World Economic Forum. Ukraine's top negotiator, Rustem Umerov, says the meeting in Davos followed discussions held in Florida over the weekend.
The Florida talks focused on security guarantees for Ukraine and plans for post-war recovery. Umerov said both sides went through the issues in detail with a focus on practical steps and how they could work. He did not say, however, whether any deals were reached. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, in his nightly address, said that work was underway on documents needed to end the war. U.S. President Donald Trump is expected to attend the World Economic Forum, where he has indicated he may meet with Zelensky. Washington has been pushing Ukraine to agree to a peace framework that it would then present to Moscow, while Kiev and its European allies are seeking assurances against any future Russian attack.
The U.S. believes its power matters more than international law. That's the warning from United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who said core principles of the UN was built on, including equality between member states, are now under threat.
Guterres told BBC Radio 4 that what seems to matter most in Washington is the exercise of power and influence, sometimes even overriding the norms of international law. At the same time, he called for reforms within the UN to tackle challenges facing its 193 member states. Guterres also criticized the UN Security Council as ineffective, saying veto powers are being used to further individual member interests, with European countries remaining permanent members. He called for changes to the Council's makeup, saying it needs to be more representative and less prone to deadlock. The Secretary General made his comments in the wake of recent U.S. actions, including military interventions in Venezuela and discussions around seizing Greenland, as he warned that power politics risk overriding multilateral solutions.
Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian has warned that any attack on Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei would amount to a declaration of war. The warning comes amid escalating tensions with U.S. President Donald Trump, who has threatened intervention and called for new leadership in Iran.
Trump described Khamenei as unfit to rule and urged Iranians to continue protesting as unrest gripped the country. Protests erupted late December over soaring inflation, a collapsing currency, and economic hardship, quickly evolving into nationwide demands for regime change. Khamenei has blamed Israel and the US for the unrest, calling Trump a criminal and demanding harsh punishment for those involved in the protest. At least 5,000 people have reportedly been killed in violent crackdowns by Iranian authorities.
A ceasefire has been declared in Syria after days of fighting between government forces and Kurdish-led groups. The truce announced by President Ahmad al-Shara comes as Syrian troops advance into strategic areas previously under Kurdish control.
Kurdish leader Mazlum Abdi agreed to the ceasefire to prevent the conflict from spiraling into a larger war that could further destabilize the country. Under the deal, Kurdish administrative bodies and armed forces will be integrated into the Syrian state. The agreement comes after months of stalled negotiations and rising tensions between the two sides. The development marks a significant setback for Kurdish ambitions in Syria. For more than a decade, Kurdish groups have sought to maintain de facto autonomy over their territories, an arrangement now increasingly uncertain.
China's economy grew by 5% last year, one of its slowest growth rates in decades. Smaller than expected U.S. tariff hikes and exporters diversifying away from the U.S. provided some support. However, domestic demand remains weak amid a prolonged property sector crisis, low consumer spending, and high debt.
China's economy expanded 4.5% in the fourth quarter from a year earlier, slowing from 4.8% in the third quarter as both consumption and investment dragged. Its GDP in the final quarter slowed to a three-year low as domestic demand continued to soften. While shipments to the U.S. fell by about one-fifth, exports to the rest of the world rose sharply, as Chinese producers expanded into new markets to shield themselves from U.S. President Donald Trump's aggressive tariff policies.
At the 2026 World Economic Forum, one message stands out: dialogue is urgent. With geopolitical tensions rising and trust on a decline, leaders say talking isn't optional, it is essential. Lead editor Najib Aruf reports from Davos.
Thank you, Studio. That's right. At World Economic Forum 2026, right here in Davos, Switzerland, dialogue has emerged as more than just a diplomatic ideal. It's being framed as a survival tool. And of course, from trade fragmentations, and we're also talking about technological rivalry and climate also inequality. Speakers are warning that without dialogue, meaningful dialogue and sustained conversation, cooperation collapses. And at the same time, many here stress that dialogue doesn't mean agreement. It means keeping channels open, especially with those we disagree with, and of course in closed-door meetings and sessions and public forums alike. There's a strong push to rebuild trust between governments, corporates, and also communities. And at the same time, what's clear is this: in the world increasingly shaped by confrontation, the spirit of dialogue may be the only bridge left between competition and coexistence. Let's hear from Sean Adam.
One thing that the World Economic Forum is very good at doing is convening the right people and putting them in the right room. As an impartial organization, we've been doing that for 56, 57 years now. And by bringing these different leaders together, it helps for different leaders from different parts of the world to understand different perspectives. Okay, and they can also share some of their reservations to certain things, under the theme of a spirit of dialogue, but also understand why certain things are being done with certain agenda, the perspective that's coming from different angle. I think that would be beneficial, that we hope to see that something positive comes out of it.
A timely reminder for World Economic Forum 2026 that in an era of division, progress still begins with dialogue.
That concludes AWANI International for tonight. Stay with us as we track the strategies and power shifts shaping the new global order. For more updates, visit international.astroawani.com and follow us on social media. I'm Cynthia Ng. Thank you for watching. Good night.